It's clear that some of the factors that went into Bernie Sanders' likely defeat in the 2020 Democratic primary race were outside of his control. The mainstream media was very likely, no matter what he did, to be highly critical of him. Moderate candidates and the DNC were always likely to target him as enemy number one, and his supporters were always liable to use the apparently PTSD-inducing snake emojis, which in turn apparently alienated Elizabeth Warren from his side, no matter how he instructed them to behave. But there were factors in his control which could have been done differently. So let's discuss how Bernie might have reversed his fate, kept his momentum going through Super Tuesday, and set himself up to become the Democratic nominee in the 2020 election. What could he have done? The breakdown of the relationship between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren was one of the most significant factors in blocking Bernie from securing victories on Super Tuesday. Just imagine what might have been had Warren done what Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg did, drop out just prior to Super Tuesday, and endorse the more popular candidate who supports a similar policy agenda. Not only would Sanders have secured Massachusetts, he might have also had a fighting chance in a number of states where he ended up losing by thin margins. And in states where Biden was sure to win, he might have lost by thinner margins, meaning the delegate tally overall might have tilted in Bernie's direction. This effect may have been even more pronounced had Warren dropped out to endorse Sanders a couple of days before Super Tuesday, and on the day before, Sanders announced that Warren would be his running mate. In the late stages of his pre-Super Tuesday campaign, Sanders did publicly disavow the internet trolls who were saying mean things about Elizabeth Warren and certain union leaders. Sanders even suggesting on the debate stage that some of them might be Russian bots. Still, he could have done more to call out those who supported him by bashing his opponents. In particular, he could have returned to some of his early campaign rhetoric about Elizabeth Warren and call her a friend and a very serious person. He could have announced that if you support him, you cannot be a bully online. This would not have stopped some of his supporters or bots from posting snake emojis or criticizing his rivals. It would, however, have taken away a negative talking point from his rivals, that he didn't do enough to control his following. It also may have helped repair his personal relationship with Elizabeth Warren, but to be honest, in retrospect, that alliance needed to be better tended to much earlier. To some, Warren's refusal to back Sanders is an indication that she was a wolf in sheep's clothing, who never would have supported Sanders no matter how well their relationship was managed. In my view, Warren, like nearly all politicians, looks out for her own political interests first and foremost. Beyond that, though, she has a very real history of fighting for progressive causes, and if she saw backing Sanders as the best way to look out for both herself and the progressive movement, I believe she would have done so. Back before the two senators announced their runs, they had met in private, and it was then that Warren allies allege Sanders claimed that a woman could not win the presidency in 2020. I am not convinced that he actually did say that, but certainly if he did, he should not have. And if he said anything that could have been misinterpreted as that, he should have been clearer. But aside from that, during this one-on-one meeting, Sanders and Warren obviously should have done more to secure the progressive strategy for winning the Democratic nomination. The two clearly made some kind of agreement to not go negative on each other's campaigns, as early on they refused to attack each other both in the press or on the debate stage. They should have gone much further. They should have made clear agreements about what role they wanted in each other's administrations. They also should have set clear markers of when one would drop out of the race to endorse the other. If not an agreement to drop out after Iowa, or New Hampshire, or Nevada, they certainly should have agreed that just one of the two progressive juggernauts would actively be campaigning on Super Tuesday. Without question, they should have explicitly agreed to endorse the other should their campaign be doing poorer in the polling. Now, because that meeting was private, they may actually have made these agreements, and Warren simply ignored them. But I'm going to go ahead and assume that the agreements were not made since there is no evidence that they ever existed. Beyond these agreements, Sanders and Warren would have done well to proceed with more coordination between their campaigns. Certainly for a long time, they refused to criticize each other. In retrospect, they ought to have done more. They could have made a regular practice of praising each other's policy suggestions, especially when their own campaign emulated policy originally proposed by the other's campaign. They could have defended each other against the criticisms they received from other Democrats, President Trump, and the mainstream media. They could have explicitly said they intended to include the other in their administrations. With full faith in the other's potential endorsement, they might even have focused their efforts in specific states. Sanders, for example, could have left Massachusetts to Warren, while she left Minnesota to Bernie. Had they done some of these things, a virtuous cycle of positivity might have prevented the rift from forming. Recall, the hostilities between Sanders and Warren originally broke out over one Politico story about an unnamed person posting a negative electability argument about Warren in Sanders' campaign Slack group. Had the two built a little more trust throughout this campaign, something that small might have flown under the radar. Beyond his relationship with Warren, Bernie also ought to have better managed his relationships with Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard. Both clearly liked Bernie a lot before the campaign season began, with Yang citing him as an inspiration and Gabbard having endorsed him back in 2016. Both have since endorsed Biden. Sure, Biden was basically a shoo-in before they did, but clearly, had Bernie done something for them earlier on, he might have secured their endorsements when they still mattered. The timings of many endorsements, in fact, were problematic for Sanders. Jesse Jackson endorsed him on March 8th. What if instead he had endorsed him on February 28th, just prior to the South Carolina primary? That might have softened the blow of Jim Clyburn's endorsement of Joe Biden. Although it was clear that politicians like AOC, Keith Ellison, Ro Khanna, Pramila Jayapal, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar would be endorsing Bernie Sanders, perhaps the endorsements might have come a little too early to maximize the potency of those boosts. Were Sanders riding a perfectly timed endorsement wave leading into Iowa, his lead in the popular vote there might have translated into a delegate lead, one that was clear enough to give Sanders an uncontroversial victory there, despite the poor results reporting from the Iowa Democratic Party. While Bernie might have been able to better manage his allies, there were perhaps even more changes he could have made regarding how he dealt with his opponents. Most importantly, Bernie ought to have clearly identified that his biggest rival in the Democratic primary race was Joe Biden. Sure, early on there were opportunities for other candidates to lead the pack, but polling showed Biden leading nationwide throughout nearly the entire race. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and Michael Bloomberg all had moments in the sun where they gained serious momentum and looked like they might catch up. But aside from a very brief peak from Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders was the only candidate other than Biden to actually lead in the nationwide polling. This criticism certainly doesn't just apply to Bernie. Most of the Democratic candidates seemed to focus their attention on whichever candidate was surging in the polls in the moment, rather than the nationwide leader. While Biden was attacked in the press and on the debate stage by many of his opponents, the criticism he faced was fairly faint, considering his overall standing throughout the race. A lot of the heat he might otherwise have taken was absorbed at different times by other candidates, typically whichever happened to be gaining ground in a given moment. It seemed like most of Biden's primary opponents saw him as a very clearly flawed frontrunner, one that would inevitably fall out of favor with Democratic voters. Ironically, the apparent inevitability of his fall made his fall a near impossibility, as most candidates opted not to take on Biden aggressively. A little Oppo research from Bernie's team might have turned up the assault allegations recently unveiled by former staffer Tara Reid, perhaps early enough to have turned the tide against Biden. Clearly, there were a number of early criticisms of Biden surrounding inappropriate touching. Bernie tends to avoid getting personal or negative in his campaigning, but these liabilities to the prospective Democratic nominee are troubling. Knowing more earlier on might have helped the party to avoid choosing a vulnerable nominee, which also likely would have helped Sanders. On the policy side of things, Bernie did a fine job in putting out a very progressive platform and fighting for it in rallies, debates, and town halls. But Biden's "how are you going to pay for it" criticism of Medicare for all should have been employed by Bernie with just as much aggression and vigor against Biden's plan. The current healthcare system is, in all likelihood, more expensive overall than a Medicare for all system. Sure, it's paid by businesses and individuals directly, not through taxes, but pointing out the expense of the status quo should not have only been a defense for Bernie's plan. He should have also asked Biden again and again How are you going to pay for the status quo? Biden's biggest demographic advantage in the primary race was older voters. While Bernie had hoped that large youth turnout would help him to secure wins, this strategy was, as it turns out, not sufficient to carry him to victories in many of the places that mattered. Bernie ought to have done work to chip away at Biden's support where it really mattered for him. And he had a great talking point about that: Biden's long history of advocating for cuts to Social Security. Bernie brought this up at the 11th Democratic debate and in a campaign ad that began airing on March 11th. Had Biden's past actions and statements against Social Security been well known by older voters prior to voting on Super Tuesday, it may have been enough to put his current pro-Social Security positions into doubt. Many older voters may have gone in another direction or skipped voting in the primary. Aside from pushing older voters away from Biden, Bernie might also have done more to bring them to his side, or at least done less to scare them to the polls to vote for Biden. In retrospect, branding himself as a democratic socialist rather than a social democrat might have been needlessly incendiary, and calling for a political revolution might have sounded too aggressive to older voters. Secular Talk's Kyle Kulinski made the point, and I agree, that Bernie should have called himself a moderate and put the radical label on Biden. Bernie could have argued that adopting a healthcare system that works for everyone else in the world, does more and costs less, is the moderate solution. Trying to patch up a broken system, one that lets people go bankrupt or worse if they become sick, is what's radical. Addressing climate change with a serious effort, one that would actually bring emissions down in time to meet the deadline set by scientists, is the safe, moderate choice. Attempting to face a catastrophic problem with the minimum possible effort is extreme and radical. Voting for Iraq was radical. Bragging about cutting Social Security was radical. Choosing a candidate with many similarities to the one Trump beat last time and expecting a different result is radical. The safe choice is the candidate Trump admitted he was afraid to run against in 2016. While I've presented here a few ways that Bernie might have improved his campaign for the Democratic nomination, I do want to point out that his campaign was run quite effectively. And I don't want to say that he somehow botched it. By even temporarily ascending to frontrunner status, Bernie defied the odds and silenced critics who early on projected he would not even be a top contender. Bernie defied the odds by outraising his establishment political rivals while saying no to big money. Had Bernie continued his momentum into Super Tuesday and beyond, even then, even with a clear plurality of pledged delegates, Bernie still would have had to fight for his life against the very real risk of a brokered convention and unpledged superdelegates voting for his top rival, even if it meant defying the will of the people. For now, Sanders supporters will have to accept that their guy is not going to end up in the White House. Not now, and at his age, probably not ever. Still, with a politician who has defied the odds so many times in the past, Bernie fans can look forward to what the man will do to further the progressive movement as a popular politician and U.S. Senator, rather than having to long for the lost potentiality of a President Sanders and ask, what could he have done?